It's all going on at Norway Chess, both on and off the chessboard. 2 weeks ago, we had Fabiano Caruana, who asked the organisers if he could withdraw from the tournament, but they persuaded him to play. We had Shahriar Mamedov, who had toothache at the start of the tournament and didn't know whether he'd be able to play, but he seems to be all right now, just about. And yesterday, Ding Liren had a bike accident, fell off going around a corner and fractured his hip. Poor guy, and he's been in hospital today having surgery, and it's not clear whether he's going to be able to continue playing in the tournament. We wish him well, of course. On the chessboard, it was a very interesting day. Wesley So and Vishy Anand had quite a tense struggle that ended in a draw. We were expecting big things from Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen, but Nakamura with white, well, you can see this is the position after 24 moves. He played very unambitiously to Carlsen's surprise, and they made a draw a few moves later. So, well, Nakamura had said he wanted to go for Carlsen, but looks like he's all mouth and no trousers. But definitely the most interesting game of today, the fourth round, was Sergei Karjakin against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and you're going to see something pretty special here. This was an excellent game. So Karjakin with white, well, we know that he likes to play e4, but he dabbles with d4 as well, but you know, it's not his main choice. So clearly he's got something prepared, and Vachier-Lagrave played his favourite Grunfeld. So this is quite predictable. And that can be dangerous because you could walk into some serious preparation. You know, in the Grunfeld, there are so many forcing lines. And the players, well, Karjakin has selected the old main line. I used to play this with black years and years ago when I was a kid. And at that time, the main line here for black was Queen C7. I think it was called the Smyslov system. This was the most popular, and the idea is you bring the rook to d8. But well, over the years, it's shown this is actually quite risky. Then we had Bishop G4, which was played in many Karpov-Kasparov games. Also, I mean, highly theoretical. But in recent years, over the past decade or so, B6 has become the most popular move among the top players. So it's very simple. You know, you want to bring the bishop to b7, you want to trade here, bring the bishop to b7 and develop normally. And you can play queen d2 in this position, queen d2, rook c1, they're both possible. And, you know, white can play quite aggressively on the king side, but Karjakin was playing very quickly, and he took this line, took the pawn on c5, which is, well, you're not going directly for a kingside attack. You're a pawn up. This kind of pawn sacrifice is so typical for the Grunfeld. Once the two pawns are split, then black can use the e5 square, and the bishop's diagonal is opened up as well. So automatically black has compensation. Now, if pawn takes, then white would hoover the queens and take on c5, and that's a reasonably clear pawn. So queen c7 is the... Whoop, I beg your pardon. Queen c7 is the move here. Standard Grunfeld, the queen looks down this diagonal, but also looks at the c file as well. And this has been played in many games, actually. And Vachier-Lagrave has had this, well, according to my database, at least 3 times anyway. So now the knight has to move, otherwise knight c6 and bishop d5 is coming. So knight e5, all been seen before. Knight b5 pushes the queen to perhaps a slightly awkward square, but theoretically supposed to be absolutely fine for black. Vachier-Lagrave previously has played a6 here against Bacro, but that didn't work out so well. He managed to draw, but it's not best. Here he took on c5, and he's played this on 2 previous occasions. The most common move here is f4. and then knight g4. Let me just show you this very quickly. Takes on c5, and now there's going to be a key move, e5. And although black is still a pawn down, you can see the e pawn is isolated, so is the pawn on c3. Lovely square for the knight, and this knight on a3 is somewhat out of play. So black has decent compensation there, and in practical play, black has done fine. Instead of that, Karjakin played rook b1. So this is a little bit unusual, has been played before. Here, knight d4 played previously, but instead Karjakin played knight a3. He was bashing out his moves in this game, which is of course slightly unnerving for Maxime. And as Karjakin said after the game, computer says black is fine, but in a practical game it's not so easy to play. And that sums things up pretty well. This is still a very tricky position. All Vachier-Lagrave knew was that it should be okay for black, but he said afterwards that he hadn't looked at this variation for a very long time. So f4. Wanting to push back the knight, but rook d8 is a good move because that removes the queen from covering g4. And now the knight goes into g4. So you don't want to give up that bishop, so that one got taken. And now f5. And now we can see what the problem is for black, that although you've managed to get the bishops, having played f5, bishop on g4 is somewhat vulnerable. Its route backwards is trapped, is blocked. So obviously there's there are problems here. So black should take this. I mean, that in itself is quite a brave move. And if h3, then this really isn't working because that gets taken and the queen swoops down to g3, check, and the bishop is also on prise. So after taking here, then knight c4. That's a very cool move. You've given up a pawn, but time just to bring the knight back into play. And it's a very, very complex position. There are so many strange tactics here. So one key variation is, well, for example, what happens if you take on e4? So the queen captures, bishop goes back, but now out of the blue, rook b7 traps black's queen. See, that knight covers the important squares here. The queen goes back and knight b6 traps the queen. I mean, I think this is actually not a bad way for black to play if you're content with a draw. I mean, I think only two results are possible from this position. Either it's going to be a win for white or it's going to be a draw. White is obviously better. But somehow with the bishops, I feel that black has reasonable chances to hold that position. But okay, not a very pleasant prospect playing in something like that when you know you're definitely worse. So Vachier-Lagrave kept the fight going with e6, and that is definitely the best move. But again, things getting very, very tactical now with that bishop in a spot of trouble, sidelined on h5. So Karjakin took on e5 and black recaptured. And now bishop g5, excellent move. White's still a pawn down, but white's white's still a pawn down, but his pieces very actively placed. Every single one of white's pieces is doing a great job, and this knight we're going to see is such a tricky piece. And this is a key position because black has several alternatives here and very difficult to determine which is best. And Vachier-Lagrave didn't get it right. He should have played rook f8 here, which is a very unusual move. Let me try and explain why That's actually the best move in the position. So the rook is attacked, and I suppose the obvious move is to play rook e8. But then the knight comes into b6, hitting the rook, and this is very awkward. So you can see these squares are taken. a7 looks miserable. So rook b8 looks normal, and now knight d5. And this is very difficult for black. There isn't really a good square for the queen. So for example, queen d6 allows bishop f4. Not so clever. And going back a couple of moves, queen d7, we exchange, and then play queen d3, and white's initiative is just huge here. So you can see straight away threat here. There's also the possibility sometimes to play queen g3 with some kind of double attack on king and rook. That's also a motif in the position. Huge attack for white there. So rook f8 is the best move, and the reason is that after knight b6, the rook has actually made room for the queen's rook to come to e8, and this is actually okay for black. Now, knight b6 after rook f8 is not the best. Knight e3 still gives white a pleasant initiative, but after this, black looks like he can hold the position. But these moves are really, really hard to find. So coming back to this position, Vachier-Lagrave played f4, so he wants to ditch the exchange. If that's taken immediately, then actually the two bishops give black pretty good compensation. If the queen moves away, then you take here, for example. But Karjakin correctly played queen f2. He was still roughly in his preparation at this point. He couldn't remember exactly how it went, but he knew this was very, very playable for white. Let's put it like that. Now there's a difference. If black plays bishop takes c3 here, then instead of grabbing the exchange, in fact the bishop cuts back, hitting the queen. Queen moves, and now bishop e5 is an excellent move. And well, let's just continue it a little bit. And once again, knight b6 causes some problems for black. So if rook b8, then knight d5 is a beautiful move. Strange tactics here, but basically the queen wants to come to g3, checking and hitting the rook. And otherwise that knight is threatening to come in on one of these squares. Tactics just click for white in this position. So queen f2, this is the game continuation. So white is basically wanting to take the exchange, but can sometimes just take here and go for a big attack. f3 played, interesting move. So ditching the exchange, this happened. And if pawn takes pawn, then black after queen f4 gets superb compensation. That knight now not looking so clever, the king not looking so great. We want to take here, cut back to d4, good compensation. But this, I think, is where Karjakin played brilliantly. He played queen h4, and that in itself is a very cool move. So there's quite a choice here. I suppose the obvious move is bishop g6, and now there's a fantastic move, rook b7. So this is one of the points of playing queen h4. You're looking at the rook on d8, and if queen c8, then you can force the queen to move. But okay, that's not so great. So queen takes b7. Here's the idea, and well, this is actually very, very good for white after rook e1. It's still very complicated, but I mean the players were agreed that this is excellent for white. I mean that's very tricky to analyze. There's also rook d5, but then comes this. When the players thought that maybe this was a better chance for black. But black is the exchange down, and you know, with these trades, certainly white has a clear advantage here. Anyway, coming back to this position. So this is the game position, and here pawn taken on g2. Now, instead of taking this, this is very cool. Basically, the pawn provides some cover, but the rook first of all activates. And there is still this idea of rook b7 hitting the queen and coming down here. Bishop f3 played, and that covers b7 and of course protects the pawn. Now, excellent move, rook e3, and then rook be1. Vachier-Lagrave said after the game he thought this was a great move. So white is basically massing his forces, ready perhaps for rook e7, perhaps for rook g3, and black actually doesn't really have a very good move here. Rook f8 played, so just obviously taking the rook out of the line of the queen and protecting f7. But now knight e5. Excellent move. So this was enabled by doubling on the e-file. And well, after the game they thought maybe king h8 was a better move, but still after this, now a very neat move. Rook here looking just to take the pawn. White still in the driving seat. Bishop d5 played instead. Rook g3. See, this is the point of bringing the rook up. See, I really like it that this pawn on g2 wasn't captured, but just switching the rook over really nicely. Now black is in huge trouble. So the threat is queen g5. If f5, very often that's a good move to defend along the 7th, then knight d7 is a beautiful winning idea. So hitting the rook and preparing rook e7, well, among other moves. And if queen takes knight, yeah, rook e7. And white wins. So f6 played by Vachier-Lagrave. Knight d3. Well, black has several defenses here. You could try bishop f7, but again, this move, rook e2 is quite attractive. And don't forget the knight coming to f4 to dislodge a bishop coming to g6 if necessary. So in this position, well, bishop takes a2 was played, but this is a complete collapse now, because after c4, very nice move, shuts the bishop out from the defense. And now it was very easy for Karjakin to wrap up the game. Once again, after this check, he doesn't take the pawn, but just comes to h2. The bishop comes back, but it's too late. Mate threatened. f5 defends for one moment, and then knight h5 is the killer move. If rook f7, then rook there is going to win. I think that was an absolutely tremendous game. Very deep preparation by Karjakin, but also very clever preparation. You know, in this day and age, it's very difficult to get a winning position from the opening. But what you can do is try and find a position that from a human point of view is very difficult to defend. And that's what Karjakin did brilliantly there. So that means that Karjakin is now just a half a point behind Magnus Carlsen after 4 rounds. Do check out the playlists in the description. And there's that game I mentioned yesterday from the London Chess Classic between Carlsen and Aronian. You'll find the link also in the video description as well, which shows that at the moment Carlsen has Aronian's number. Thanks for watching.